All right, everybody, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you again for being here um, during this last day of virtual learning. I have C cards here for those of you who have been consistently here, which it seems like that's everybody. Um, Everybody who's here right now, you guys have been here consistently, and I really thank you guys for putting in that effort to be here in virtual Zoom class. Obviously, we return to the classroom tomorrow. I think everybody who's in Zoom right now is in-person learners. I will see you guys. Well, actually, I won't see you guys until after Thanksgiving because I will be gone next week. Um, so we will have an activity instead going on Monday. Because remember, Monday is a B day next week, so you are expected to be here in class, in my class, during this time on Monday, even though originally it was supposed to be an A day. So just keep in mind with that. Um, a couple quick things. So we're going to be moving on today with Unit 3. We're going to be continuing. Um, Specifically, we're looking at one of the standards covering globalization and how that relates to um, culture. But before we get into that, thank you guys for those of you who have taken the uh, Unit 3 Part 1 test so far. I think everybody who's in the Zoom right now has gotten that submitted. But if you haven't yet, make sure you get that done. It will lock up, I believe, at 6 tonight or at 11:59. Regardless, it's due tonight. So make sure you get that done and submitted. I'll start grading those hopefully tomorrow into Friday and have them done by Friday. But remember, there's about half of the questions that I have to actually go and manually grade. So if right now you're sitting at like a 20 or 24 um, as your score, you're pretty much on track to be getting a 3 or 4 on the exam, depending on how well you wrote out your answers for the written portion. So just keep an eye out for those grades to get updated by Friday. And then I'm still kind of backlogged with some of the weekly assignments. So I need to get those graded as well. So with that, trying to think if there was any other updates. So yeah, so just plan on coming to your A-day classes tomorrow for in-person learning because we are still slated to all be back here in the classroom tomorrow. Okay, does anybody have any questions about any of the assignments so far, the test, or what I've covered? All right. If there aren't any pressing questions, then we'll go ahead and get started. So what I'm trying out today, you guys are going to be my um, guinea pigs, so to speak. I'm trying to figure out ways to be a little more interactive, especially when we do virtual learning, because I'm certain that this probably won't be the last time we will do a 2-week virtual learning, just with the way that cases are currently. Um, so just to think about things in the future to get you guys a bit more engaged or get a little more classroom experience, I decided I'm going to try out a Nearpod. So I think some of you guys maybe have experienced having a Nearpod as a student. Some of your teachers here at Cypress may be doing that. But if you guys could go ahead and get joined to this Nearpod, I have the code right here, and then it's just join.nearpod.com. And then once you get entered, just similar with Kahoot. Um, well, I would prefer if there's at least some way I can identify you, because I'm actually going to be looking at um, how engaged you are in class. So try to include something to identify yourself. Um, so if at the very least have like a first name, that would be preferred. And then if you want to have an optional or a different name, you can do that as well. But as long as I can tell that you're the one who owns that account or is logged in, that would be most preferred. So I'll give you guys just a minute here to get joined here. It's join.nearpod.com, and you just enter in this code. And once again, make sure you have a name that I can identify you. These Nearpods, if we do Nearpods in the future, won't be necessarily graded, but I still expect you to participate And if I don't see a lot of participation, then I will start making them graded. All of the responses and everything like that, I only see those. I will conceal them from everybody else being able to see them. So you won't ever have to worry about, maybe if you got the wrong answer or don't understand the question. But yeah, so let's go ahead and get joined here. Do about 1 more minute to get joined. Okay. Go ahead and see just everybody who is joined. And I'm assuming Mr. Turtle is Albert. And let's see. Go ahead and hide names at this point. So from this point on, yeah, these will randomize and nobody will be able to see anybody's response. Actually, let me stop sharing just for a second and make sure I reshare so that we can get the audio, because we have one video we're going to look at today. Okay. So yeah, so if you could answer this first poll question. So are most material items made in the United States? So just thinking about like anything you own, whether that be laptops, clothing, even food, think about whether those items are typically made in the United States or you usually see them being made in other countries and other parts of the world. So I think you guys understand this. So this will be a good introduction, but most of you, answer that not all items are made, material items are made in the United States. We're going to kind of look at why that is. We spend a little bit more time on the economic side of this question with Unit 5 at the end of the year. But we're going to look at a little bit more of the cultural side of why material items are primarily made outside of the United States. So very few things are actually made here in the US anymore. Okay. So let's go ahead and move on. So this question here, this one, if you had to guess what's the longest flight in the world, go ahead and choose this because we're going to be looking at transportation today. So just randomly guessing if you can think of what would be the longest flight in the world. Okay. So it looks like we've got some 20 hours there. And then looks like it's kind of divided between 20 hours and 10 hours. I think those are both valid claims, especially if maybe you haven't traveled that much as well. We're going to look at what ultimately is the longest flight in the world and how that plays a role in spreading culture. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. Let me, 1 second here. Okay. All right, sorry. So with this question, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that as the responses start coming in, I can just see your responses. But basically, just in a couple, 1 or 2 sentences, do you think it's good or bad that most things that we use here in the United States are made outside of the US? And then I want you to just kind of justify it. So is it good or bad that most things are made here in the US, or that most things that we use here in the US are made outside of the US? and then just explain to me why you feel that way. And I will give you like 2 minutes to respond here. Okay. Just waiting on a couple more of you to get your answers submitted. Give you about another minute. Sweet. Thank you all for writing in some answers here. I'm seeing kind of a divide amongst the class. So I think that we got a couple of you who are saying um, it's a good idea, or it's good that we have a lot of these items made outside the U.S. because it makes things cheaper on our end. We don't have to spend a whole lot of money to, get these items. I think that, and then I see some answers that says that it's maybe not so good because, um, you know, it could has some issues if we end up ever going to war with some of these countries that end up um, making our goods. So if we ever go to war with them, or whether that be like an actual physical war or a trade war, it's going to make things a bit more expensive here. I'm also seeing some responses here that say that it could be bad because it cuts out jobs here in the US, that we don't have those opportunities for people to make money here, and we're not keeping our money within our country here because of those items being made outside of the US. So we really good responses so far. We'll see how maybe some of your perspectives or opinions may change after we look over some items here. So
Also, one thing about the war part
mhm.
is that's why we make our own guns.
Yeah, that is part of the reason we, manufacture most of the weapons we have here in the U.S. are manufactured here. So that's one thing. If we end up ever going into a conflict, physical conflict with another country, we don't necessarily have to worry about running out of munitions as some other countries would experience that. Okay, so let me go ahead and reshare the screen, but you guys are all on the Nearpod, so you should be able to see this information. But basically what we're gonna be talking about today primarily is a concept known as globalization. So some of you may have heard this term before, maybe some of you are just hearing it for the first time. Globalization is something that geographers refer to when it comes to the modern era in geography. Um, Globalization is something that we'll see now for the rest of this course. We'll talk about it for culture. We're going to talk about it with Unit 4 and government and political structures. And we'll talk a lot about it when we get to Unit 5, which is economics. But basically, globalization is the development of an increasingly integrated world, which includes the economy, political structures, and culture. So, what I mean with globalization is that there's this concept that's kind of developed over the past, I'd say 1,000 years, where as humans continue to expand their, or develop more and more and acquire more and more territory and land, and begin to trade with one another. Um, this concept of kind of sharing culture, sharing ideologies, governmental beliefs, and being able to trade with one another came about and being known as globalization. And globalization is uh, basically recognizing that our world is not really fractured or divided as we used to think it is, and it's actually a lot more integrated and interconnected. Um, and there are some really, and that inevitably we will get to a point where our world is so connected that things like culture, like government, and stuff like that is going to become less and less divisive or important in the long run. And we'll look at specifically some factors that lead to globalization today, especially how it relates to culture. And then we'll also look at the pros and cons uh, with globalization, especially in relation to culture. And then we have an assignment that you get to work on today and into next week, basically having you identify globalization in your own home. So um, basically, what I want you to understand, just for the term globalization, is that globalization means our world is becoming more and more interconnected and coming together in terms of economics, politics, and culture. So let's look at the first aspect of globalization that's really come about in the last, um, I'd say, half century. We have what's known as technological globalization. That with the advent of the internet becoming more popular towards the end of the 90s into the early 2000s, we've seen globalization kind of skyrocket, and we see the world being able to be more connected. Because imagine that, before internet was really in existence, the only way to really communicate with somebody was pretty much either through telegraph or through snail mail, sending a letter to somebody or a telegram. Um, but not everybody had access to electricity or telegraph system. So the only real great way to communicate with somebody was through mail, and that could take weeks, if not months, to get to certain parts of the world. But nowadays, like I can go, and I, have several friends from all over the world. I have a friend over in China, and if I wanted to right now, I could just open up WeChat and I could send him a message asking how he's doing. And within a few seconds, I could probably get a response from him, even though we're separated by thousands and thousands of miles. But the problem with technology increasing globalization is that not everybody has access to internet. Um, right now, we have about 4.6 billion people in the world that have access to the internet. Now, remember, our population is about a little over 8 billion. So we're looking at over a little bit over half of the world's population have access to internet. The other half really don't have um, access to internet. Even if they had access to internet, usually they don't have access to um, like computers, laptops, or even smartphones. So keeping in mind that yes, theoretically, you could probably send a message to somebody on every continent, um, but the chance that every single person on that continent is going to have access to that internet um, is not that high at this point. But there are some companies out there that are trying to increase this number. Companies like Facebook are working to launch satellites into space to kind of create a um, global network of internet. Um, that basically, if you are, say, in the middle of the savannah in Africa, um, nowhere near any type of Wi-Fi or electricity, if you have a Wi-Fi capable device, you'd be able to connect with the internet via satellite. And that's ultimately what Facebook is trying to do. Some other tech companies are also trying to get in on that action because it's coming down to less so about the economics, whether you can make money off of that, or it's coming more so about kind of a moral obligation that our world so much depends on technology today that Those who don't have access to internet are kind of left out of the loop. Um, one other way that technology has kind of, obviously internet itself has helped us become more connected, but how do we communicate through the internet? And one massive way is through social media. Now, I'm assuming that most of you have some form of social media. Um, whether or not that's something, obviously you can't be on it during class, but I'm pretty certain that most of you have a form of social media, and social media can be anything from Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, um, Pinterest, Twitter, to being able to send text messages. Text messages are a form of social media, um, and so any way that you're communicating through the internet is an example of social media. So let's look at share of the population in the world that uses the internet. So as you can see, what part of the world do we really see no internet being used? What continent would you say has the least amount of internet users based off of this map? Anybody want to take a shot?
Africa?
Yeah, Africa, right there. As we see right down here, whole continent of Africa, and this is something we notice when we see a lot of maps, whether it's about internet or um, development, anything like that. We always see that Africa is kind of behind the rest of the world. Specifically in Central Sub-Saharan Africa, we see a lot less development in these countries. Primarily, the reason there's not a lot of internet here is because electricity is not as widely used in these countries. So obviously, if you don't have electricity, you're probably not going to have um, any type of technology in terms of like computers, laptops, or uh, smartphones. But the rest of the world, especially in more developed countries like Europe and North America, into South America, Australia, getting into some parts of East Asia like South Korea, Japan, heavily use the internet. In fact, most of the internet users in the world come from Japan, Korea, and Saudi Arabia, ironically. We see most of the internet being used from those countries, but internet's a big part of our life. Internet's the way that we are having class right now in a pandemic. 50 years ago, if we were, or in the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic when they closed down everything, uh, you know, basically school was closed, school was canceled. Um, didn't have the opportunity to have class during this time or ability to turn in assignments electronically. So, internet's very much helping us, even though there can be some downsides to the internet. But you guys are fortunate to have grown up in this kind of modern era, modern world with internet, because I remember when I was more so when I was in elementary school, we had dial-up internet at the school. We had those big, bulky, fat computers. I remember I was trying to watch a YouTube video because YouTube was like this brand new service, and they had all these cool videos about or videos on video games that I liked at the time. And I would try to log in on school internet, and it would take like 5 minutes to buffer or load 5 seconds of video. It was very, very slow. Um, and I didn't get my first smartphone until I want to say it was freshman year. That's when I first got my actual smartphone, and that was a BlackBerry. Um, and so technology has very much changed, even in the past, 10 years since I've um, been a freshman in high school. So you guys are kind of fortunate to be able to benefit from high-speed internet and this technology. How about what's the top messenger apps around the world? So, um, most of you guys, if you have a Facebook Messenger is the primary form of messaging in the US. Obviously, this is including just general text messaging, because text messaging is probably the most popular form of communication through technology in the world. But if we're talking about a specific social media platform, Facebook Messenger is dominant here in the United States and Canada, parts of North Africa, Eastern Europe, Australia, parts of Southeast Asia. But then you notice what's there in green. Maybe it's kind of hard to see on there, but some of you guys may have this app. It is WhatsApp. WhatsApp has become very prominent around the world, especially in most of Europe, Western Europe, South Asia, into Russia or with Russia, which let's see, do I have it on here? Yeah, they don't include the contact. Okay. One thing with China though, and let me see if hold on. Thing with China is that um, in China they have what's known as the Great Firewall. Um, Back in the early 2000s, China started really cracking down on what websites people could in China could view, and China outlaws a lot of the apps and social media that we're used to here, including Facebook and um, I believe Instagram's also outlawed. Snapchat is outlawed in China. Um, and so instead, China's created its own types of social media platforms. The most popular in China is what's known as WeChat. And in fact, WeChat, I have that on my phone, but it's no longer, you can't actually download it here in the US anymore because it's been outlawed and banned by the US government because WeChat is solely owned by the Chinese government and they can monitor even if I'm sending a WeChat from for myself to another American friend, China can monitor and see what I've been texting. The only reason I use it is that when I was over in China, my Chinese friends they that's the only way that they can really legally communicate. And WeChat is also used as a virtual wallet in China because very few people in China actually carry around credit cards. It's all virtually done for the economy. But we'll talk about that in Unit 5. But I just want you guys to get a sense of what apps are being used around the world when it comes to communication. Now, this is a great indication of how our world is very united. And that we have methods of communicating with each other because you can be in the southern tip of Chile and you can send a message to somebody all the way in Vladivostok, Russia, up on the North Korean border, and be able to communicate with somebody with only a few seconds delay. Um, versus back in the day, if you wanted to send a letter from Chile to Russia, it probably would take several months to get there. So we're definitely getting more and more interconnected because of technology. So let me go ahead and stop sharing here. So with, yeah, so with this question, have you ever interacted with somebody from another country? And this is online. Um, so some of you may,
Indonesia.
what was that?
Indonesia.
Indonesia? Yeah, so this could be anything from actually like having like a pen pal to if you like played video games and you had somebody in your lobby from another country. So just want to kind of get a sense. It's more so for me to see um, how much you guys are interacting with people around the world.
Yeah, I communicate with him via Facebook and help him out with battle cats.
Oh yeah. So um, yeah, because typically you'll meet the chances of you meeting somebody from another part of the world face to face in person are very low. But nowadays with technology, uh, you guys may meet each other like in a game lobby or um, on social media at some point, and then you guys start up a conversation. So like some of my closest friends um, from around the world, I met because through Facebook or I think uh, through Facebook or through game lobbies. Um, and then a lot of my other friends, obviously, since I travel around the world, I've met face to face. But okay, so I think we're just waiting for a couple more of you to respond here. Okay. Well, yeah, so it looks like, it's about 50-50. Some of you guys have interacted with people from another country. Maybe you become friends with them. Some of you maybe haven't had the opportunity yet, but I think as we get more and more developed as or more globalized as a society, those of you who haven't yet interacted with somebody from another country will definitely have that opportunity, especially when you get into college, go to a university, you'll be able to really interact with somebody. A lot of foreign exchange students at universities. So sweet. Okay, so moving on, this question kind of relating to earlier question, but if you've flown, what is the longest flight you've ever been on? And then obviously, if you haven't had a chance to fly yet, um, you can mark it as you haven't had a chance to fly yet. Okay. So it looks like we've got so far longest flight somebody's been on 3 to 6 hours. So that's probably pretty much anywhere. I'd say down south that would be 6-hour flight from Salt Lake would be to like Mexico City. Up north would be to like uh, Alaska. 6 hours would be to Hawaii, and then 6 hours would get you anywhere on the East Coast. So, um, looks like a couple of you guys have had the opportunity to fly and have been on some kind of short to medium range flights. For me, longest flight I've been on was 14 hours, and that was from San Francisco to Wuhan in China. Um, and so that's going to kind of segue us into the next section here. And we're going to be talking specifically about how transportation has really increased globalization, because it's one thing to be able to communicate over the internet and talk with one another, but another way that globalization has become very much more apparent in our world today is because we're able to travel and see people a lot faster than we used to in the past. Because transportation used to be one of the greatest hurdles to globalization, especially prior to the internet. So if you think about one of the first ways that globalization really became a part of society came about once the Americas were discovered by the Europeans. Um, and ultimately, back in the 1500s, if you think about um, our lovely friend Christopher Columbus, not so much. His ship took about 2.5 months to get from Spain to the island of Hispaniola. Fast forward a couple hundred years, we're still traveling by ships, but to get from Europe to say New York is about 6 weeks. Then 1845 goes down to 14 days. What do you guys think happened in 1845? How do you think they went down from 6 weeks to 14 days?
Cars were invented.
Cars, not well. The first prototypes of cars were invented um,
Rain.
by then, but we're talking about over the Atlantic Ocean. But cars do play a major role in globalization later down the road. But what about um, the basically automatic ships, steam powered ships? We have the first steam powered ship created here in the United States in the 1830s. And so by 1845, we're getting the first steamboats that are going across the Atlantic. So what used to take 6 weeks by traditional wind sailing now is down to 14 days by coal-powered steamships. Then we fast forward to 1952. 1952, we have very fast steam-powered ships. Now we're getting to even more gasoline-powered ships. And then in 1957, we get the first crossing of the Atlantic Ocean by a massive propeller plane. Obviously, we get the first crossing in the early 1900s, but 14 hours by propeller plane. If you wanted, you could buy a plane ticket by 1957 if you wanted to go to Europe. 14 hours, pretty good. 1959, we get the first jet plane is built. and it only takes 8 hours to get from New York to London or London to New York. Then in 1976, it gets down to 3.5 hours from New York to London. There's a plane that was invented by the British and French called the Concorde. It was a plane that could travel 1,400 miles an hour. And it was a supersonic jet, meaning that it traveled faster than the speed of sound. But ultimately, they ended up getting rid of the Concorde in 2003 because it was too expensive to run, and it couldn't really travel that far because of the fuel limit. A round trip ticket on a Concorde from New York to London cost about $12,000 round trip. So you had to be really in an emergency or needing to get to London from New York to spend that money. Now today, you can get from New York to London in about 7 hours on any typical jet. Sometimes depending on the time of the year, you can actually get from New York to London in less than 6 hours if the wind's really strong, the jet stream. The thing is with transportation is that as we've developed more technology and better abilities to travel, especially with air travel, costs started becoming a hurdle as opposed to the actual technology. So back in 1912, when the Titanic set sail, third class, which was the lowest class, it was a nice class compared to some other ships at the time, but the lowest class ticket cost about $200 in today's money to get from England to New York. Now, if you for the same routes on airfare, you can get that as low as $30 one way from New York to London on certain airlines. But typically, it's going to cost you probably about $200 to $300 round trip if you're flying out from New York to London. Okay, so I'm actually we're actually gonna watch this video live from my point of view. So let me get it screen shared. Audio. So what we're going to look at is
PN Plus, now bundled together. The greatest stories and characters, the just streaming TV.
We're going to look at how you can get from essentially one part of the world to the other in a very short amount of time. Because we're going to be looking at Qantas Airlines. It's the Australian-based carrier. Has a new flight from London to Sydney. It is the world's longest flight, and it is a total of 20 hours. Adds up to about 20 hours going from London to Sydney, Australia. And we're going to look at how, this route used to take, if you were going by land, that route used to take several months, if not almost a year to get from London to Sydney. And then with previous air routes, it usually would take well over 24 hours to 48 hours to get to Sydney. So we're going to go ahead and look at this experience of going from London to Sydney in a matter of less than 20 hours.
I'm one of just 52 people who's about to spend the next 20 hours in the sky as a sort of human guinea pig on one of these research flights, which goes directly from London to Sydney. So they're testing out tricks to try to make ultra-long flying easier, and we hooked up to a bunch of monitors to see if they work. So get the countdown started. 6 a.m. We're about to take off, but Qantas now wants us to operate only on Sydney time to help with jet lag. So it's 5 p.m. Let's happy hour. So fun fact, 2 centimeters straight steps. Right, so just that one. Now these exercise stretches top and notice on the ground I have flexibility. It's something that made up in the air will help. No, absolutely. No, just like breakfast that have to fall asleep. So makes sense. It's just sandwich and jelly and dessert. That's my favorite sandwiches. So because special research flights, everyone has to fly business. But normally, no flight, it's the back of the plane. So I suggest to the group, give the company a go. That's what we think. Brain monitor, which had a really scary moment at the beginning on their too, or no brain activity. How will learn how to make man. So it is making changes pilot as well. Everyone's awake now, just had breakfast, and there's just under 5 hours to go. And we needed a reminder. This is the longest flight you can take. Here is second sunrise. That's two sunrises in one flight. Just and yeah, and it's big. And inside is the reality.
Okay. Sorry, the audio cut out there a little bit. But essentially what I want you guys to get from that video, let me go ahead and go back to Nearpod here. So basically what I want you guys to get from that video is the fact that, we now have technology, especially by air travel, to get from pretty much any part of the world to another part within, 24 to 48 hours. When in the past, it used to take, several days, weeks, if not months. But talking about a route from London to Sydney, we're talking about nearly 14,000 miles being traveled, and it does take 20 hours, and that's why airlines like Qantas is doing these test flights, because they recognize that as our world becomes more and more globalized, there's going to be more and more of a need to travel from one part of the world to the other. And people ultimately prefer doing nonstop flights than having to go and connect. Because in the past, it used to be if you're going from, say, London to Sydney, you would have to either connect in India, in Singapore, or Malaysia, or in China before going on to Sydney. But now it's feasible to be able to fly nonstop. And that's not even the longest flight anymore. What airline was it? I think it was Emirates Airline announced a nonstop flight from Panama City to Dubai, and that takes about 22 hours going west. And there are some talks about getting a flight from Singapore to New York City, and that would also be about a 22-hour flight. So those of you who've had the ability to fly so far, you probably remember maybe how uncomfortable it may have been if you were sitting like an economy class, just for a couple hours. But imagine sitting in that seat for upwards of 20 hours. But then again, you get to go from basically one entire part of the world to the other. So what I have here for on the Nearpod, these are all the current routes that are flown in the world. And this, if you want to see a visual of how globalization works, just look at this map here. And you can see how basically if you wanted to go to every single continent, with the exception of Antarctica, is covered by air travel. Pretty much every piece of landmass, if you want to be able to get there, there's a way by air. Obviously, the more remote the place you're going to, probably the more expensive it's going to cost to get you there. But generally speaking, it used to be in the past, especially when I was even your guys' age, as a freshman, I used to think, well, it's just too expensive to travel anywhere internationally because, plane tickets to Europe are, hundreds and thousands of dollars, or hundreds or even just thousands of dollars. But like I said, you can now find airfare as cheap as $30 one way from the East Coast to Europe. And once you get over to Europe, your possibilities are kind of endless because you can travel by train or automobile, whatever it may be, across the entire continent for pretty cheap. When I went to China a couple of years ago, I was able to get a round trip flight from San Francisco to China for $450, which that's, at the same time, I probably couldn't get the same. A $450 ticket here in the US would probably get me to Florida and back. And so there are a lot of opportunities for you guys to be able to travel in the future, even if you're on a very limited budget or don't have a whole lot of money, because that was the case for me. I obviously had to work to save up the money for those experiences, but once I ended up getting over to Asia or Europe, the the work was well worth it. Ultimately, you see those cultures and parts of the world. Okay, so here is another just quick short answer. How do you think culture can be affected by globalization? So once again, just maybe a sentence or two answering how you think culture, what we've been talking about this unit, can be affected by globalization. So I'll give you about 2 minutes to work on this. Okay, just got a couple more of you. Give about another minute, get some responses here. All right, so we got pretty much everybody. So what I'm seeing so far, I think, are some great responses. You guys are on the right track. Talking about how, as the world becomes a little more interconnected, we see cultures kind of overlapping with each other. Some cultures are adapting and changing with other cultures. We definitely see this globalization through language. When we look at specifically how English has kind of become one of more common languages. It's like the middle ground language. Because obviously, like, so if you go to China, um, you know, it's important that you be able to speak Chinese. Most everybody in China speaks Chinese, but um, if you're at the airport in China or an airport in South Africa, you're going to see English on the guiding signs because even if you're, say, Russian and you're going to China um, and you speak Russian and you don't really know any Chinese, um, there's a good chance that you will understand a little bit of English so as you can get through, navigate through a terminal, say, in China, as opposed to trying to learn Chinese. So just understanding that um, culture is being heavily affected by globalization. We're going to take a look at that coming up with this slide. So as the world becomes more connective, restrictive cultures are becoming less restrictive. So if we're thinking specifically about government culture around the world, the greatest example of this was during the Arab Spring in 2011, which we'll look at the Arab Spring in detail after winter break when we get to Unit 4. But basically with Arab Spring, we had some revolutionary movements in a lot of Middle Eastern countries that had been traditionally very authoritative and not so free of society. And during the spring, we had a revolution that started in Tunisia in North Africa. And the people there who were revolting, they ended up sharing their through social media, like pictures of the event, why they're fighting, and all of that stuff. And it kind of transcended throughout the entire region. And friends who were living in Libya, friends who were living in Egypt and Syria, all started to see what was going on in these other countries, and they ended up revolting in their own country. And we see how that had an effect on the culture when it comes to government in those countries. But some countries are trying to limit globalization when it comes to culture changing. So in China, they're specifically, trying to kind of control the narrative by blocking certain social media platforms in the country and certain websites, so as they can ensure that the only information that the people of China are learning about is coming from the government. A great example of this is that and you guys will, we might talk about it with Unit 4, but this is something you'll probably learn in world history. We talk about an event called Tiananmen Square. It's the big central square in Beijing in China, and in 1989, there was a kind of revolt against the Chinese government, and there's mass protests at this square. There were a lot of protesters who were killed by the Chinese government. I think it was in the tens of thousands. But the Chinese government quickly suppressed the kind of revolutionary movement, and they ended up eliminating any trace of that event happening. Nowadays, if you even try looking up Tiananmen Square 1989 in China, your internet will be shut off, and the authorities will come and question, interrogate you, and potentially imprison you for mentioning that event. I have to be very careful when I'm talking with my friends in China, so as to not mention anything that goes against the Chinese government or questions Chinese authority, because it's not necessarily for my protection. It's more so for their protection if they're caught with that information. So that's one way that China specifically and some other countries are trying to limit globalization on that component. They love globalization when it comes to trade and economics, but not when it comes to cultural shifts. So this is probably these next two slides, last two slides are going to be probably the most important slides for today, because you want to make sure to get some notes recorded down, because we're going to look at the positives and negatives of globalization in general, and this will help you on the assignment that you basically get the rest of this week and into next week to complete. So we're going to look at the positives and negatives of globalization. That's why I asked you at the beginning if you believe that having items made outside of the United States is good or bad. That kind of gets you thinking about globalization in general. So under the positives of globalization, we talk about how goods can be produced in other countries for a fraction of the cost to the consumer. So this is more on the economic side, how in countries like China and Taiwan, Nicaragua, Honduras, the standards of labor are a lot lower, and that you can get away with paying a worker, say in China, for $2 an hour, um, and produce those goods a lot cheaper than having to pay somebody at least $7.25 an hour here in the United States to produce that same good. So the reason that a lot of our clothes and items here are so cheap is because we're able to, um, have those goods produced in another country um, where they don't have as stringent labor laws. Um, Some of the other positives of globalization include more opportunities to connect with other humans around the world, convey an open society, allow for the sharing of ideas and traditions. So when we're specifically talking about culture, we can talk about how, we looked at the Day of the Dead celebration and how that's kind of becoming a part of our general culture here in the United States, even though it originated in primarily Mexican and Latin American um, heritage and culture. And so the benefit of having a more globalized society is that we get to experience more traditions and see how other people live around the world. So that's definitely a positive when it comes to globalization. And that really relates back to the ability to be able to travel and connect with one another. So those of you who have interacted with people from another country, it's just kind of amazing to be able to talk with somebody who's halfway around the world, on the other side of the world, and get to hear about their experiences, what's going on in their lives, how it's a bit different than what you have here in the US. So I think that when it comes to globalization, I really enjoy that component, that aspect of being able to interact with people. Then we have negatives. So negatives are going to be more so on the economic side. So with that, having items being produced for cheaper outside of the US, it benefits us, but does it really help the workers there in developing countries? If you're getting paid $2 an hour in a developing country, is that really going to support your family? Is that really enough money to make an honest living? And in most cases, more cases than not, in more instances than not, it's not going to be enough to support your family. So ultimately, a lot of people who are in those developing countries end up moving to the United States because we have higher standards when it comes to labor or ability to pay more. Some negatives of globalization, we have, at the same time, we have freer society, more free ideas, exchanges of thoughts happening for positive, but negative is that we get chances for some more radical beliefs and ideas to come about and be spread quite rapidly. So if there's ever, like, say, a civil war, and the other side is able to communicate and spread their beliefs and everything quite rapidly. So that's one negative there. Takes a toll on the environment with increased emissions. So if we're talking about increasing trade, increasing overall travel around the world, we're talking about using more and more fossil fuels, which is going to have an impact on the environment. And then, generally speaking, we tend to see more cultures decline or consolidate. Consolidate means we see what used to be a very distinct culture kind of blend in and become more of a globalized culture where it's more of like similar to American culture. And from my point of view, I think that may be a negative when it comes to globalization, because if we want to celebrate a very diverse world, we want to make sure that diversity remains, as opposed to all kind of coming under the same umbrella of one culture. Okay, so it leads to the assignments that we're going to be doing this week into next week. Let me go ahead and pull up Canvas. So as always, it will be in our Canvas course in the assignments tab. And it is titled, oops, first of all, that's all last quarter's assignments. Okay, so it's going to be called Globalization Basics Culture. Want to click on that. And let me get it opened up. So not too long of an assignment, and I definitely think you could get it done, you know, by the end of this week or during class on Monday. But essentially, with this assignment, you're going to be looking at your own home, or if you prefer, when you come back to in-person learning, if you look at some of the classrooms, at the items in those classrooms, you're going to find 5 items that material items that have been made, and you're going to figure out where they were manufactured. So you have to find items that were made outside the United States. And then you're going to identify what countries they were made in. And then were those items made for, like, do those items replicate the culture of where they were made, or are they made for the culture of the United States? And then why do you think these items were made in those countries? So if you say find a piece of clothing and it's made in Taiwan, why do you think it was made in Taiwan versus the United States? So just kind of maybe a sentence or two there for that. Do you think these items should be made in the United States? Why or why not? So you can argue whether or not we should have those items be manufactured here in the U.S., or if you think we should keep them over in the countries that they were produced in. Then what are some factors that lead to globalization in general? So stuff that we covered today kind of identifies some of those factors that lead to globalization. And then this last one is very much your opinion, hopefully with a little bit of evidence from today's slides. Basically, do you support or oppose globalization? So I should see and justify your answer in about 5 to 8 sentences. So as long as I see a good solid paragraph, you'll get a 4. This last part here gets you to the 4 for sure. If you answer everything else in depth, you get you'll probably be closer to a 3. But this last question here is definitely that 4 level of assessment. So with that, so we have about 20 minutes left of class. So I'll let you guys get a head start on this. And then on Monday, when you guys are here in the class, we aren't going to necessarily have a lot of new material. And so a lot of the class time will be dedicated for you to work on this assignment and get caught up with all the other assignments in class, because I've noticed that not necessarily with you guys, but just overall that we have a lot of assignments that are missing, especially during virtual learning. So I wanted you guys to have an opportunity, since I won't be here, to get really caught up. So I will leave instructions with the sub for them to check off what assignments you have completed during that time. So with that, does anybody have any questions or concerns when it comes to this assignment or the stuff we've talked about today? Okay, I know it was a lot of talking today. It's been a lot of talking for the virtual learning. Sorry about that. I know it's not the most fun or most engaging to hear me talk for the entire hour. So once we get back in the classroom, we'll get back to more. I have some ideas for getting some engagement from you guys to get you up and moving a little bit, so we're not just me talking and asking you questions from time to time. So anyways, if there aren't any pressing questions or concerns right away, at this point, you are free to go ahead and leave the Zoom. I thank you guys so much for being here, and I will see you on Monday.